All right, so going back into my whiteboard series of Suspension Simplified. You know, no graphics, no music. Just going to get down to brass tacks, give you the basics of particular suspension terms that I think are misunderstood by a lot of people. Or they just don't know them at all. The thing I'm going to talk about tonight is motion ratio. What is motion ratio? What is it? You guys know? If you know, you're probably not going to learn a whole lot from this video. But if you don't know, we'll go ahead and explain to you. Motion ratio is simply leverage in your suspension. It's the lever that your control arm, or your wheel, or your spindle has on your spring. So your spring rate at the wheel, which I'm going to call wheel rate. Sounds like real weight, right? Real weight, wheel weight. You know, your wheel rate is dictated by your motion ratio. Your motion ratio is dictated by your suspension design and the pickup point at where your damper and spring are on your wheel or your suspension design itself. So the backstory of motion ratio for me is that when I was younger and I used to sit and look at ads for suspension for particular cars, I used to notice some cars had sky-high spring rates compared to other cars. I used to see a 240. 240 had an 8K front and a 6K rear. Okay, that makes sense. You want to have a little bit less spring rate in the back because there's a little bit more weight up front. And then plus with weight transfer and everything like that, you know, it makes sense. You don't want the rear to be too stiffly sprung or else it's going to be very oversteery and it's going to be hard to control. That's understandable. I get it. But why does a BMW E36 have an 8K front but a 12K rear? 12K rear? That seems like crazy. Like, why would you want it to be so much higher than the front? Reason why is motion ratio. Motion ratio is the entire reason why that happens. So leverage, like I was talking about before. In your typical front, or your, not front, but your typical strut style suspension, all right? This is your layout, okay? Your control arm pivot point is here, and your spring is here. The motion of this, which is your spindle, that's going up and down your wheel, and the motion of your damper and spring is almost entirely the same. It's very close. It's almost 1-to-1 ratio. Yeah, there's a slight difference, and some struts are different than others. Some are a little bit closer. And very rarely do you find a suspension in a car that's able to have a complete 1-to-1 ratio because there is still a bit of a separation from this point to this point. But it's still very close. We're talking about 0.95, 0.90. It's very close. So whatever the strut's spring rate, say this is 10K, this here is probably 9.5, 9.2. It's very close. Your wheel rate is almost the same as your spring. Now we go to a suspension design like a double wishbone design, like I've got drawn here. Now this isn't any particular double wishbone. This is just a generic drawing that I did, okay? Maybe not completely representative, but it does help me in showing my point. The point is that your motion ratio on a suspension like this is dictated, just like every suspension, I should say, not just this one, is the amount that this moves up and down versus this moves up and down. Now you can see that the damper and spring, more importantly the spring, has been moved in quite considerably. All right, so this is actually right in the middle of the suspension's motion. And since it's right in the middle, this has a lot more leverage on this side. So this is going to be closer to a motion ratio of about 0.5, so about half. So whatever this spring rate is, its actual wheel rate is going to be half whatever this actually is. So if this is a 20K spring, its wheel rate is going to be 10K. And that's all it is. That's all motion ratio is. It's wherever your spring is located in your suspension that's the leverage that the wheel has on the spring. Makes it really simple. So that's the reason why an E36, which is a car that I was giving out as an example earlier, has sometimes sky-high rear spring rates, because the rear ratio, the rear motion ratio, is 0.5. So if you're going to take that 12K rear spring rate and you divide it by half, you're left with 6. So 8K front, 6K rear. It's the same as a 240. Real simple. And if you're going to, you go to a 10K. A 10K rear becomes a 5K actual wheel rate. Real simple. Not a big deal. You know, strut style suspensions are simple in that respect because you almost don't even have to apply a motion ratio. They're just whatever the spring is to whatever the wheel is. I mean, it's almost exactly the same wheel rate as it says for spring rate. So if it says 10K, it's pretty much a 10K wheel rate. It's a little bit less, but it's very close. Now, its motion ratio though kind of doesn't really depend on where the damper picks up. That's the one thing though. Some people get a little confused about that. It's where the spring picks up. Okay, because the damper can sit kind of like anywhere. Now the amount of force that the suspension has, now if you're talking about valving, yes, it does matter. But as far as spring rates concerned, it only matters where the spring is. So like when we talk about, say, like a Fox chassis Mustang. Fox chassis Mustangs, they have their spring on inboard on the control arm. So they have their motion ratio, even though it is a strut style suspension, right? It's a strut style suspension, but it's not a unistrut. The spring is separate. So the damper's out here, the spring's inboard. The spring is going to have, I think it's like a 0.45 motion ratio. So the front spring rate in a C5 Mustang is like, they're ridiculously high. Very, very heavy springs, right? And like Miatas have very high spring rate for being an extremely lightweight car. I mean, you see them with an 8 and 6 spring rate, and you're like, wait a minute. The car only weighs 2,000 pounds. It weighs 2,100 and 2,200 pounds. Like, it's super light. Why does it have such a heavy spring rate on it? Well, motion ratio. Now, Miata motion ratio is really not that bad. Their pickup is further forward here, so it's actually, it's like 0.75, so it's not like a complete half, because otherwise that wouldn't make sense having 4K, 3K in the car, even if it's being that light. But anyway, that's pretty much the gist of it. That you now understand motion ratio. If you didn't get what it was before, you get it now. There really isn't any simpler way to explain it. So yeah, if you like this video, check out the other ones that I have. I have one on Ackerman, and I have another one on scrub radius. I'm working on, every other night or so, once I basically sit down or when I don't have anything else to do. I'm going to film one of these videos, and if you can toss it a like, maybe subscribe, be really happy about that. Anyway, thanks. Have a good night.